Well, welcome everyone. And thank you, Gary, for the opportunity of presenting. So I want you to think about, it's about 5 p.m. on the 22nd of April, 1917. There's a gentle breeze blowing from the east. Canadian observers from the 1st Division observe and notice a greenish, yellowish cloud emerging from the German lines. It rolls over the French trenches to the Canadians' left or north. Shortly after, they see French soldiers jumping out of the trenches, clutching their throat, staggering, collapsing, dying. It's the first gas attack. Over the next 5 days, the Canadian Division will face overwhelming German assaults. And while they're driven back, they fight every step of the way. They die hard. And to my mind, that is the definition of what a functional fighting force was or is. But this functional group was shackled to a gravely dysfunctional training, recruiting, and administrative echelon. So what I want to discuss in this presentation is to give a 360-degree view of what the Canadian Expeditionary Force was in 1915. And I'm going to start by talking about how did this situation develop. And let's talk about some background. So in 1915, Canada is huge, small, and new. It's huge geographically. I'm broadcasting this or making this presentation from the province of British Columbia, one of 9 in 1915, and it alone is 3 times the size of the United Kingdom. Canada's population is small, just under 8 million, 2 million of whom have arrived in the last 10 years, and many of those from areas outside of the British Empire. The country's less than 50 years old. And there are huge fault lines within the country between English and French Canada, between regions, between new immigrants and those that have resided in Canada for years, between urban and rural, between workers and bosses. Canada is also a federal and self-governing dominion, and both of these are important. Self-governing in the sense that when Britain went to war in 1914, so did Canada. But Canada could determine the extent of its commitment to the war effort. Federal in the sense that important powers devolved to the provinces, like British Columbia, things such as roads, education, healthcare. So the federal government really only touched people's lives through the post office. Further, it's got limited state capacity. Its largest government department has less than 100 employees. Currently, Human Resources and Development Canada has 80,000. Its tax base is based on customs duties. It's not until 1917, when income tax is introduced as a temporary measure, that it actually has the ability to generate a lot of revenue. All of which is to say is that even if Canada wanted to have national programs, it did not have the capacity to do so in 1914 and 1915. Militarily, the only direct threat Canada faced was the United States. Far larger, far greater population, and with Canada's population clustered along the US-Canadian border, Canada was effectively indefensible. It relied on the empire to act as a counterweight. Now, from the comfort of the 21st century, what was the threat from the US? But you have to understand, in 1915, there are men who had fought at the Battle of Ridgeway in 1866 to repel the Fenian invasion from the United States. Further, as late as 1911, the Senate Minority Leader was quoted as saying publicly that he believed the annexation of Canada was inevitable. Where Canada put its faith is the militia myth. The idea that free-born men who ride hard and shoot straight can defeat any number of unthinking professional automata. Every Canadian, as you know, is born with a rifle in their hand and are out hunting bear by the age of 3. Well, this, of course, is nonsense. Even in 1915, the majority of Canadians lived in an urban environment. But it was a comforting myth. But they did have one proof point. Canada sent 8,000 men to South Africa during the Second Anglo-Boer War, most of whom are mounted riflemen, like the 2 chaps you see in the photo. And from the Canadians' perspective, they had done well, certainly much better than the British professionals who were routinely thrashed by the Boers, who happened to be a militia. So Canada's military consisted of a permanent force of 3,100 men scattered across the country. To give you An example of this, Canada's only regular army battalion, the Royal Canadian Regiment, was spread across 5 stations, geographically about the size of Western Europe. There were 74,000 militiamen who nominally received 12 days training a year, but basically they are ill-trained. Now, it's often associated that the Canadian militia is like the territorials. I would argue Canadian militia was at a state of development that more closely attuned to the old British militia. There were some good units, but a lot of them were going through the motions. It was as much, especially in urban environments, a mechanism for performative masculinity. Here you see Arthur Currie, later commander of the Canadian Corps, resplendent in his mess uniform for the 50th Gordon Highlanders. So this was a chance to strut your stuff on parade, also to meet the movers and shakers of the community who normally belong to the militia. Further, this is an intensely political force. And to give you the best example I can think of this, a battalion commander was summarily dismissed from his command on parade in front of his battalion for the grave and irredeemable offense of being a known liberal. The Conservatives were in power during the war. So military experience. Here is a shot taken from the 1912 maneuvers or camp season. Canada had no expeditionary experience. Now, before someone asks, what about the 8,000 soldiers that Canada sent to South Africa? Canada's role in that was to get them on a ship in Halifax, after which the British managed everything. So administration, training, casualty care, payments, equipment, all of that's done by the British. So Canada had no experience in dealing with military forces an ocean away. Canada had limited military experience. There's the Fenian raids in the late 1860s. There's a Northwest Rebellion in 1885, where the greatest challenge was getting the troops to the battlefront, and the 8,000 that served in the Boer War. The final point I want to make is that in 1909, Canada agreed, along with the other dominions, to follow the British lead when it came to organization, establishment, structure, equipment, training. With one exception, Canada was going to go its own way when it came to the equipment for the soldier. And more on that in a moment. So the country is led by Sir Robert Borden, elected in 1911. And remember, I mentioned Canada was a self-governing dominion and could choose the level of commitment. Borden wants to use this opportunity, and he wants to make Canada's commitment as large as possible so that Canada can gain a larger say within the empire. He doesn't want to leave the empire. He just wants Canada to have more say in matters. But he has limited military knowledge, and he has a very much hands-off attitude, at least for the first 2 years of the war. And he leaves that responsibility to his Minister of Militia, Sir Sam Hughes, you see here in the picture. Now, Hughes is pugnacious, partisan, chaotic. You'll see this word a lot. He is Trump before there was a Trump. He's also a throwback to another era, and he's very controlling. This is a man who cannot delegate. Now, in the context of a government department with 100 employees, minister can make all the big decisions. But when you're controlling 250,000 personnel, it becomes far more challenging. He's also a man you do not cross. Part of the reason why Borden has a hands-off attitude. He's a master of invective. He's a great debater. He's a magazine publisher and a great populist. He's the type of man that President Lyndon Baines Johnson said, you want the bad man inside your tent pissing out, not on the outside pissing in. Further, Sam was a great believer in the militia, and he's a teetotaler. And so he has no time for the permanent force, the regulars. He calls them nothing but a bunch of barroom wasters. At the start of the war, he makes 3 key decisions. He decides to form the CEF, more on that in a moment. He chooses the combat commanders for the Expeditionary Force. And surprisingly, for the most part, he makes good choices. There are a few failures, but certainly no worse than you see in other militaries in 1914. But his administrative choices are universally abysmal. So Canadian Expeditionary Force. Sam Hughes decides to toss out the existing mobilization scheme. He sends Canada's only regular army infantry battalion to Bermuda, and he establishes a brand new institution only loosely connected to the permanent force and militia. It would be as if Kitchener had decided to form his new army, not on the basis of the regular army or the territorials, but a third entity. The result of all of this is chaos. But what Sam can point to is his ability to set up a camp at Vaucarche. This is just outside Quebec City. And you can see in the background all of the huts. So this is facilities thrown up in 6 weeks on virgin ground that can house 35,000 men. You got parade grounds, drill locations, the world's longest musketry range. There are latrines, running water. It is a master class in throwing together a camp. And Hughes uses this as a proof point that his methods work. And it becomes a very strong argument in his favor for many years. So the infantry and the Canadian Expeditionary Force are all new entities. They are composed of anywhere from 4 to 8 different militia regiments. The other arms are raised based on the existing mobilization scheme and are less chaotic. 75% of the senior combat officers, that's lieutenant colonel or majors and above, sorry, in the CEF initially, are militia officers, 30% of whom have any active duty service. So when you compare the average Canadian officer to their British counterpart, they are vastly less qualified. So by the end of September, or pardon me, the end of 1915, Canada has sent to the front a Canadian Corps raised in September, the 1st Division in February, 2nd Division in September 1915, 4 battalions, including our friends, the Royal Canadian Regiment, returned from Bermuda, and the 1st and 2nd CMR brigades. These are mounted riflemen similar to the ones that I showed you earlier, except they don't really work all that well on the Western Front. So the 6 regiments as part of these brigades are being converted into infantry. And you can see them in this picture from late 1915. There's not a lot of opportunity for mounted warfare. Canada also sent a cavalry brigade with its two permanent force cavalry regiments. So total Canada has sent 28 infantry battalions, 6 CMR regiments, 5 artillery brigades, and 2 cavalry regiments, not an inconsiderable force. Now, I want to make the case that the Canadians in 1915 are a functional fighting force. I'm going to give you 3 examples. The first is the Second Battle of Ypres. It runs from the 22nd to the 27th of April. The key date's the 24th of April, when the Germans attack the Canadians head on using gas. They have a 5-to-1 advantage in artillery. They've got a 2 to 3 to 1 advantage in manpower, and they drive the Canadians back. But the Canadians fight the entire way. They do not disintegrate. They do not fall to pieces. They continue to fight, and they die hard. About a third of the division falls in the battle. To me, that is, again, a definition. This is not the elite strike force of 1918, but this is a functional force. Within a month, the Canadians are thrown into battle again at Festubert. And there they have limited offensive success, certainly no worse than any of the other British formations that were there. It was generally not a great success. And they also had multiple hindrances, including maps printed upside down, artillery programs that ended 5 minutes before the attack, and being ordered to attack off the march. Despite this, they still did reasonably well, and they suffered another 2,000 casualties. Again, this is the definition of a functional force. The third example is a different scale. So this is taking place in the Messines salient. It's a raid that takes place in November 1915. 2 battalions are involved. The 5th tries to get through into the German lines, but barbed wire prevents them. The 7th does. They inflict what they estimate are 30 casualties. They take 12 prisoners, suffer 1 accidentally killed and 1 man wounded. Now, in the overall scale of things, this is a really minor engagement, but it's a signpost. It's an important signpost for 2 things. First, it begins to show the Canadian capability and competence when it comes to rating, but it's also a signpost to how the Canadians would approach battle through parts of 1916 and definitely in 1917 of rehearsals, care to attention, preparation, getting all the details right. And that was one of the marks of the Canadian Corps, is that it's continually learning. So we've talked about the functional side. Let's get to the less functional part. Start with recruiting. And there's Robert Borden at a recruiting meeting. So Borden wants to push all of Canada's chips into the pot. He wants to get as much leverage as he possibly can. So he sets the recruiting limit to 250,000 men in October, raises it to 500,000. This is in a population of less than 8 million people. But there's no notion of the feasibility of these numbers. There is no national program that is keeping track of where troops are coming from, who's going where. And this is despite recruiting is already starting to lag by mid-1915. By the end of 1915, Canada has authorized 172 infantry battalions, 13 CMR regiments. These mounted rifle regiments are about 2/3 the strength of an infantry battalion. So of this collection, 50 battalions reach the front. There are 6 pioneer battalions and a handful of forestry and railway troops. A pretty poor result for the investment. And there's a substantial investment in raising these. So how Canada approaches this is all done through volunteers and local initiatives. It is estimated that it costs on average £175,000 per battalion. And this is a cost that's borne by the community, the colonel, and his officers. So when they arrive in England and there's not a job for them, they're not happy puppies. And the problem is that Canada does not set up a replacement system for the infantry. So the only source of manpower, and with the infantry suffering 90% of the casualties, is to take battalions that arrive in England, break them up, and send the men to the front, to the obvious frustration of those that had spent the time and money to raise these units. The result of this is an inefficient, ineffective system where there are grave misallocations of units at the front. For instance, both British Columbia and Quebec had too many units at the front to be able to support them with replacements. And so units had to be disbanded or their recruiting areas changed in order to reflect that. The one advantage it had is that it's cheap. It didn't require a massive structure to be set up, and it's all the costs are being borne for the recruiting and raising on the units themselves. So administratively in England, there is a confused situation, to put it politely. So Sam Hughes sets up a special representative, Sir Max Aiken, later Lord Beaverbrook, a mover and shaker in the highest reaches of the British elite. He sets up a special representative as well. And then not one, but 2 general officers commanding Canadians. And as you can see, this is going to be a great example of how not to set up an administrative structure. Further, the 3 choices he makes for officers are appallingly bad. They're very weak. So how does this come about? Well, Hughes wants to control all of it through himself. He has an outdated understanding of what's happening at the front. He's still thinking of Victorian era warfare and does not understand the impact of the mass mechanization and artillery power, etc. Further, he wants to control every decision. So as a result, it's a very different matter to control 100 people versus 250,000. And because he wants to control all of this, decisions are invariably delayed. Now, his choices, they're all Hughes's creatures. They rely entirely on Hughes's power. As soon as Hughes removes his approval, they're gone. They too have an outdated understanding of what's happening at the front. And at times they have to do things that they don't agree with, where their conscience is overridden. And that's because they rely entirely on Hughes. And you read their letters and diaries, There's constant infighting. They neither like nor respect each other, and they're always poking fingers in each other's eyes. And the most egregious issue is that they ignore legitimate complaints from the front about how bad things are. They think everything's fine, and they're not interested in hearing anything else. The result is an inefficient and ineffective system. And to give you some examples of this, Canada distributed $6 million. It's not a bad sum these days, but in those days, it's an enormous sum without proper oversight. Canada could not get its men back to the front after being wounded then at a rate that the British were able to accomplish. These are just some of the examples of just how bad things were. And it's not cheap. There's an enormous amount of overhead and waste existing within this administrative structure. So let's talk about training. So training is conducted by battalions in Canada. So that 172 units are all training away. But they have a limited and outmoded understanding of what's happening at the front. There's very little exchange of information from the front to England and England to Canada. The only officers returning from the front are those that are either have been sacked or have been grievously wounded, neither of which is a good source of information. Further, their training is constantly being interrupted because of the conflict over getting recruiting starting to lag. Units take months to get enough men, and in the process, they lose men. So some units go through as many as 3,000 recruits before they send 750 to England. Further, when they arrive in England, units have been embodied for 18 months, are found out to have completed or are accredited with having completed 3 weeks of the War Office training course, because the training kept getting interrupted and they had to start from scratch again with a new body of men coming in. In England, this situation was no better. When units went to the front, who did they leave behind? The halt, the lame, and the incompetent. Who were the instructors in England? The halt, the lame, and the incompetent. Further, they had an outmoded understanding of what the conditions were at the front and were uninformed by what changes had occurred. And then just to add on to this, soldiers were being trained on inferior Canadian equipment. So the Ross rifle is a superb weapon if you want to take out 5 Germans at 500 yards, and it is probably going to cause your death if you have to take out those 5 Germans at 50 yards because it's going to jam. Their tunics are too tight. Their boots disintegrate on contact with the earth. Their harness equipment strangles the men. The Colt machine gun that they use is so inaccurate that it cannot be trusted to do indirect fire because the cone of dispersion is just so great. Result of all of this is poorly trained troops, and it is not cheap. There's an enormous training organization that exists in England that is very much wasteful. So what are the consequences of this? And just if anyone's interested, this is Sam Hughes receiving the salute of a battalion marching back taking place in 1916. Behind him, the rather portly figure is the division commander at that time, Arthur Currie. So what are the consequences of this? Enormous amounts of waste, most of which is hidden from Canada, certainly through 1915. There's limited understanding of just how chaotic the situation is in England. You get poorly trained replacements, and where it really hits is during the operations in 1916. The Canadian Corps could not sustain its combat excellence at the Somme because it was receiving so many poorly trained recruits that were as much a danger to themselves as to the Germans. And further, the overexpansion of units eventually led to the necessity of imposing conscription, which caused riots and a lot of angst. In fact, there were riots of such a nature that civilians were killed in the streets of Quebec cities in 1918. And the repercussions of those events are with us to this very day. Finally, what it illustrates is two very different trajectories. One of the defining characteristics of the Canadian Corps was its desire and nature of constant improvement. It is constantly looking, how can we do better? So it goes from a functional force in 15 to basically being apprentices in 1916, journeymen in 17, and masters of the art in 1918. What you don't see with the other echelons is that type of improvement. You would expect that the Canadians, with their lack of experience in overseas forces, they're going to be rough patches. Everyone has them, but they did not get better. At best, they're mediocre. And the mediocrity continues on to Hughes and his creatures are swept away at the end of 1916. Experienced officers are brought from the front back to England, and the system is transformed. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for that, George, Antonia, and Bill. Those were three excellent presentations. In the usual way, perhaps we can raise our hands as a silent but nevertheless heartfelt appreciation of the work that's been done by our three speakers in entertaining us this afternoon. And I know you can't see these, but there is a cacophony of hands going up, if that makes the metaphor, so you can virtually hear, hopefully, the round of applause. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's the Q&A time. One from John Azar. John asks to Bill, what was the relationship like between the British senior officers working with the Canadians and the Canadian military establishment in Britain? That's from John.
Yeah, okay, great question. The issue is that the British attitude is quite interesting, that given the chaotic situation, there's at one point there was a plaintive cry from the War Office, who's in charge of the Canadians in Canada? Because in 1916, there were 6 different authorities who claimed to be speaking for Canada in Britain. Generally, it was, I think, okay. The view was the Canadians can do their own thing and continue operating, as long as they, not losing battles, we're not going to intervene too much. And I think the surprising thing is that the British didn't step in more so, given just how chaotic the circumstances were. But there was very much a hands-off attitude by certainly senior British officers to the Canadians, and in fact, bent over backwards on a lot of cases, asking for, do you want to get involved in this? Like, for an example, there was a discussion from the Air Ministry asking about, well, does Canada want to set up its own Air Force? We're fine with that. We'll be happy to help you with it. And the Canadian reaction was, no, that's okay. We'll wait. So it's not a case that the Canadians were always having to push against the British to try and grab more responsibility. The British were more than happy to hand it over if the Canadians asked.
Can I just add to that? I absolutely agree with that. And I think it's also true with British relations with the other dominions, particularly with Australia, which is the nearest comparable one to Canada, but also to New Zealand and to some extent to South Africa. Sometimes I get the sense that the British bent over backwards to accommodate the dominions. One thing that's always struck me is whether the Brits would have been quite so amenable had the Dominion troops been completely useless. I think basically they recognised them for their fighting ability, and also, of course, there's a really real sense that it isn't a question of Britain and the Empire, but Britain and the Empire are effectively the same thing. Of course, it spills over sometimes too far, as in, Curry stands up against Haig in early 1918 about, not allowing to split up Canadian divisions from the Canadian Corps. But basically, I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that most people in Britain and the Dominions regard themselves as being part of the same political entity.
Exactly. And I think the point is that Borden wanted to get greater say within the empire, not leave the empire. And so throughout the war, yes, definitely the British were bending over backwards. And part of it wasn't just the fighting forces. 4 of the top 10 fighter aces in the RAF were Canadian. So there's a considerable, something like 20% of the pilots in the RAF an RFC were Canadians. Canada, before America entered the war, was a great venue for funneling loans and money from the United States to Britain when they wouldn't do it directly. 40% of the 18-pounder ammunition fired on the Western Front was manufactured in Canada. So food, all of these things became very important to the British war effort. Hence the attitude.
Great, thanks for that. Brian Wilson asks, what do you see as the single most significant factor that brought about the quantum change in the overall performance of the Canadians through their learning curve during the war?
Well, I mean, obviously it's difficult to say there was a single factor because there's a multifactorial issue, but I think that the largest is just attitudinal, in that the Canadians knew they were starting from well behind the British. And in a sense, they had an advantage because conditions were so much different than what was expected. The experienced British officers, maybe took a little bit longer to make the adjustments that were necessary to these different situations, whereas the Canadians knew they knew nothing and knew they had to get better. And so there was this attitude towards learning, like you'll see after every major engagement. Now, it's no different than the British Army, but because of the unique characteristics of the Canadians, they could better implement a common doctrine across all 4 divisions. And by 1918, they're making major changes to their organizational structure, which no British unit could do. But it all stems from the learning process that they went through and interpreting the changes and accepting that we don't know everything. We need to learn a lot.
Thanks. Anything to add to that, Gary, or are you?
No, I absolutely agree with that. And I do think the Dominion forces, again, the Australians are a good comparator here, do have an advantage because they are both British Army and not British Army simultaneously. You might say they're British Army when they want to be, but they're not when they don't want to be. They do have a certain amount of autonomy, which does mean that they can do things differently. And of course, one of the key things is the fact that the Canadians and the Australians have their own permanent corps structure, which the Australians don't get a single corps until 1918, whereas British Corps routinely, you have divisions cycled through every few months, because it's not until 1918 that British Corps tend to get a stable situation, which does mean it's much more difficult to impose uniform doctrine, ways of doing things than it is for the Canadians and the Australians. I mean, and that from the British point of view is a self-inflicted wound or injury.
Super, thanks for that. Roger Mason asks, please can Bill comment on the drive to and the success of conscription amongst the First Nations?
Well, the First Nations were, sorry, that's not an area that I have done a lot of research in, but they were treated with kid gloves in a sense, that there was concerns about their ability to interact. There were certain populations where they didn't understand English or French. And so it wasn't that it was imposed. There were a lot of opportunities for conscripts to get an exemption, and something like 96% of those that were conscripted had requested an exemption. Now, when they did arrive at the front, they fought well, and they were critical to keeping the Canadian Corps fighting in 1918 during the 100 days. So there was ongoing efforts to recruit. Some units or some areas were happy to have First Nations people. They were regarded as natural warriors. In fact, some of the leading snipers in the Canadian Corps were all from First Nations tribes.
Thanks. And there is, I can't remember the name of the cemetery, but there is it Joseph Standing Buffalo, the famous headstone on the cemetery just south of Addis. I don't know if he was a sniper. Yeah,
that's, I won't even try to pronounce his name, but he was credited with something like 138 sniper kills. And he was well respected within the unit. My sense is that once they got to the front, a lot of the prejudice and so forth fell away, that if you were seen to be fighting with the others and pulling your weight, then you're one of us. Unfortunately, that did not continue when they got back home to Canada.
Okay, right. Thanks for that. And possibly another one for Bill here. What were the proportions of Canadian recruitment between British descended, French descended, and Indigenous Canadians? Obviously, you've just touched on the Indigenous to a certain extent there.
Right. So this gets really sticky in looking at these numbers. There are differences in by regions. So French Canadians, like Quebec speaking, or pardon me, French speaking Quebecers did not volunteer at a similar rate. There was very little opportunity. There was only one of the 48 battalions that was French speaking. The manuals weren't in French. There was very limited effort in trying to get French Canadians to join the CEF. And when a conscription was imposed, there was, of course, a major pushback. They sort of the French Canadian version or view of this was, well, if English Canada wants to go to war, that's fine, but just don't drag us into it. But there were major regional differences. So the Maritimes, you get a lower percentage of men that are recruited. You get much higher percentages in Western Canada, in large part because that's where much of the recent immigration had occurred. So there were literally hundreds of thousands of English men that had recently immigrated that were single and were anxious to fight for the empire. And that's one of the reasons why you had so many units reach the front from British Columbia, because it was one of the key spots where people ended up. So if you take a look at it regionally, the West has a much higher recruiting level. Ontario is sort of in the middle. Eastern Canada is at a lower level, and French Canada is a bit lower than that.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks for that. Gary, we're up to 4 o'clock already. And it's the old adage of time flying when you're enjoying yourself, but I am conscious that we have hit the 4 o'clock mark. I don't know if you want to sum up or ask any questions or draw any conclusions, Gary?
Well, I can't possibly sum up, but I just have a few stray thoughts which might help to bring this afternoon's proceedings together. I mean, this morning I said that it struck me that 1915 is all about it being a transitional year. That it is both the end of the beginning, as in moving from mobile warfare into static warfare. Well, that's the tail end of it anyway. But also it's learning that the war is going to be rather different from that has been prepared for before the war. And so 1915 is a year in which you see the beginning, if not of the end, at least the beginning of the middle as well. So it's a rather trite thing to say, but it is a bridge between the opening stages of the war and the deep attritional, at least, form of war, at least on the Western Front. The other point I guess I could make is that all three papers in different ways have touched upon the way in which 1915 is a critical stage in the development of total war for Britain and the British Empire. That in the case of India and Canada and the use of woman power, these are expansions on ideas which either didn't exist before the war or were there simply in embryo. I think if you take them from the perspective of the three subjects, looking back from the end of 1915, nobody 2 years before would have believed that would have happened in the course of the year. Another thing which comes out loud and clear, particularly from, well, actually from Antonia and George's talks in particular, are mentalities. And something which certainly has been an eye-opener to me over the last few years is just to get our heads around the way that people thought then, which is either different from the way we think now, or now we are thinking differently. We're starting to sort of differentiate various strands of thought. So I think that in terms of the Indian soldiers, British generals, British commanders, I think actually had, split views on it. I mean, they both feared Indian troops, I think, as we've come across, that the shadow of the mutiny of 1857 was never entirely from their memory, while admiring them simultaneously. And this is a mixture of straightforward, racial thought, but a whole other lot of cultural baggage, which is quite difficult for us to get our heads around today, because we have moved beyond it, or we've moved beyond it in some ways anyway. Same way as Antonia's stuff about women. I mean, no one bats an eyelid these days if you see a woman doctor or a woman surgeon. Trying to think our way back into the mindset of 1915, however, is a really big jump. And so that's something just to finish up with. It's something which I think we all have to engage with when we look at events which are now 100+ years ago. I've made this point before, but I think we still fall into the trap of thinking about the First World War as being current affairs, because it is just beyond living memory for some anyway. And in many ways, people seem quite similar to us. Actually, they thought very differently. Unless we get our heads around that, it's difficult to put the events of 100 years ago into a proper historical perspective. And all three papers today, in different ways, I think, helped us to come to terms with, we are talking about historical events, not contemporary events.
Great. Well, thanks for that, and thanks for the three papers, George, Antonia, and Bill. And together with the three speakers from this morning, we've certainly been entertained and educated, I believe, during the course of 2 hour sessions. I hope everybody's enjoyed it as much as I have. If we'd like to just do a final silent round of applause for not only the 3 afternoon speakers, but the 3 morning speakers as well. That's splendid. I can confirm that there's a hands going up as a round of applause. And on that note, I think we'll call that a day. So thanks to all 3. Thanks to Gary for presiding over this, presiding as president. And I think that's all from me. So thanks very much. Mademoiselle from